Okay, well, poor New South Wales Premier Chris Minns asked his planners for a simple one-page document showing how the approvals process works in the state. They came back with this, and look, it's giving me a headache just looking at it. I'm joined now by former New South Wales Liberal MP and CEO of the Urban Development Institute of Australia, and the man I was talking to when we came back on air and I could not hear, Stuart. Ayres, great to see you.
Great to be here, Erin.
I was asking you during that commercial break for your reaction initially to this announcement of and you'll know it better than I, that Chris Minns made today, of a three-person panel that can make the process quicker and cut out the council at some levels.
Yeah, so the Premier's announced a housing delivery authority. It's made up of three very, very senior public servants, the head of the Department of Premiers, the head of the Secretary of the Planning Department, and also the head of Infrastructure New South Wales. So when it comes to the public service in New South Wales, you probably don't get three bigger names. So this is a really clear statement from the Premier that I think he's had enough and he wants something that can cut through the rubbish, particularly for those bigger projects, to get more houses on the ground and more keys indoors.
Will it work, do you think?
I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. I think it's a reflection of the fact that the system is too complicated. We just saw that diagram. That diagram probably doesn't even have every decision point and requirement on it. I've been talking to some people across the industry over the last couple of days since they've seen that, and they all say, oh, it left off this bit and it left off that bit. So there's even more complexity in the system. And so this is a real strong position from the Premier around saying we've got to work our way through that. We've got to make sure the big stuff gets out, and we need to see more homes being built in New South Wales.
What else do you think, because you've obviously come from government, but you're now in private sector, what else can the government do to make your job now easier? And your job is to, in some way, shape or form, help ease this housing building crisis?
Yeah, so what we do know is that we've got to be able to put more enabling infrastructure in the ground to allow houses to be built. So it's a really challenging economic environment out there. For developers and builders, costs are high, labour costs are high. So the cost to build an apartment or build a house is never been higher. But at the same time, the borrowing capacity or the buying power of the consumer has never had less money to be able to buy a home. So we know that at the moment it's costing nearly 45% of an average income to buy an average priced house in Sydney. And the multiplier of the average income for a mortgage is nearly 10 times your income.
Yeah.
So that's a big gap. So putting more enabling infrastructure on the ground will allow more homes to be built, being connected to water and sewer, so there's less time waiting. That time equals a cost that gets passed on to the consumer. The other thing that the state government could do is perhaps not pass on some of those infrastructure or contributions costs to the end home buyer. They could absorb a bit more of that out of the state budget, so more of the homeowner's money can be used on a home and not infrastructure that's in the ground.
Are you looking at some things now and going, yeah, we should have done some stuff differently?
I think there's some things that we tried to do as a government. We tried to reform the Planning Act almost 10 years ago and it failed in the Parliament. I think there's lots of good things that were done in that exercise that could be revisited by the Premier and the opposition leader if they wanted to be a little bit more bipartisan in their approach to the Parliament. But we are still talking about a system that did punch out 72,000 homes in a year. If we did that every year between now and the end of the housing accord, we'd be pretty close to hitting that number.
Yeah.
So the system can do it, just needs everyone pointing and working in the same direction.
You mentioned prices there. New South Wales Housing Minister Rose Jackson, she had a bit of a Barry, if that's the saying. Have a listen.
Well, I mean, it kind of depends where in Sydney. I mean, Sydney's a big city. You know, I mean, a couple of $100, right? Like,
Where can you get a two-bedroom flat for a couple of $100?
Well, a week, I don't know. There are places in Sydney you can. I mean,
so that was her answering the question of how much it would cost people to rent a two-bedroom apartment in Sydney. She's tried to come out and defend herself, saying that live radio is a hard format. She got a bit jumbled, etc. What's your reaction to that? Is that a forgivable mistake, or is that just not good enough in that decision?
You'd be familiar with a famous TV show where the public servant would say, that's a courageous decision, Minister. I would call this adventurous behaviour by a minister. It does give a pretty strong signal that perhaps she's not quite across what's happening in the community that she does have some responsibilities for. So I think I can understand why lots of people would have heard that and thought, does that minister actually know what I'm having to deal with every single day? The idea of being able to rent a property for a couple of $100 in Sydney doesn't exist. I think everyone knows that, and I'm pretty certain if Rose had her time again, she'd probably do that a little bit differently.
It was like, I remember when they'd named a minister for like the ending of domestic violence, and that minister, I think 7 months in, still hadn't sat down with Karen Webb and spoken to her, and you kind of think people in those positions need to be across certain basic things, and you lose faith in them if they're not. Very quickly, Western Sydney, something, a place that you love greatly, know a lot about. You're the minister for there. What's the situation like there now? Does it feel very divided to you?
I think Western Sydney still feels pretty good, but it's under immense economic pressure, and the household budget is where all the pain is at the moment. So I would say to anyone who's involved in politics at the moment, if you're not focused on how the household budget is feeling at the moment, whether it's the cost of a house, the cost to fill up the car on petrol, I always have this image of a person who's trying to juggle the mortgage, get kids to school, and then go to the supermarket, and how many aisles can they get through before they start thinking, I don't have enough money to go to the next aisle. If you don't have that person in your head when you're thinking about policy, then I suspect you're probably going to get a bit of a whacking at the ballot box. And in places like Reed and Parramatta and Werriwa, I'm sure that household budgets are under immense strain in those communities.
Donald Trump was speaking this morning and told the story of a woman tried to buy 3 apples, had to put 1 back and come back. And, you know, it's the economy, stupid.
No doubt about it. And we have to spend more money on housing, whether it's a mortgage or a rent, much, much higher percentages than we've ever been used to before. And so you never see that money. It goes straight out through the bank, and all of a sudden you're going, geez, how do I fill up the car? How do I do the groceries? How do I buy something nice for my kids? And when you have to start making those tough choices, you're probably going to start asking, is the government doing everything it should be doing? Really
great point. Stuart, so wonderful to have you back on. Really appreciate
your
time and your expertise. Thank you so much.